Carmen Ruiz had just finished pouring water into the glass of the restaurant's richest customer when she saw something that made her hands tremble. On the open documents in front of him was a signature she had known since childhood, handwriting she had seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and school notes. Alejandro Vasquez, the billionaire CEO who dined every night at El Prado in Madrid, was studying contracts signed by her father. A man Carmen had believed dead for 15 years, after he mysteriously disappeared when she was only 8. But what she discovered in the following minutes would shake both their lives. Her father hadn't died, he had been betrayed by his own business partner. And that partner was precisely Alejandro's father, who had built his empire on stolen projects and the ruin of the Ruiz family. Now Carmen was serving €1,000 dinners to the heir of the man who had destroyed her family, unaware that tonight, fate was about to deliver justice in the most unexpected way. Carmen Ruiz had learned long ago to be invisible. At 23, after waiting tables at El Prado restaurant for 4 years, she had perfected the art of moving among wealthy clients without ever drawing attention. She was just the waitress who carried expensive dishes and served fine wines to people who spent in one night what she earned in a month. That October evening, Madrid was wrapped in a fine rain that made the city center lights even more alluring. El Prado was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, frequented by businessmen, politicians, and movie stars. Carmen worked there Monday through Saturday from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., earning barely enough to support herself through her architecture studies and help her mother with the rent. Alejandro Vasquez was seated at table number 8, the corner table with a view of the royal palace, reserved only for the most important clients. At 42, he was the CEO of Vasquez Holdings, an empire stretching from construction to new technologies. Forbes had included him among the 50 richest men in Europe, with an estimated net worth of over €2 billion. Carmen knew him well, at least by sight. He came every Tuesday night, always alone, always impeccable in his suit. He invariably ordered the same menu: Iberian ham, lobster paella, roast lamb. He never spoke on the phone during dinner, never smiled. He seemed to carry the weight of enormous responsibilities on his shoulders. That night, however, something was different. Instead of the usual financial newspaper, Alejandro had opened a folder of documents on the white tablecloth. Carmen approached with her usual discretion to pour the water. When her gaze fell upon the paper scattered in front of him, her heart stopped in her throat. At the bottom of one of the contracts, written in that elegant, unmistakable handwriting that had accompanied her childhood, was the signature of Miguel Ruiz, her father. The water jug began to tremble in her hands. Miguel Ruiz, the man Carmen had believed dead for 15 years, the one her mother had told her had disappeared in a car accident when she was 8. The signature was recent, dated just 3 months earlier. Carmen tried to remain calm as she poured the water, but her eyes remained fixed on those documents. She couldn't be mistaken. She had seen that signature on hundreds of greeting cards, on school notes, on permission slips for field trips. Alejandro looked up, noticing the waitress had remained still longer than usual. He looked at her for the first time, truly, noticing her wide green eyes and the pallor that had spread across her face. When he asked if everything was all right, Carmen managed to stammer that signature belonged to her father. Alejandro looked at her confused, then lowered his eyes to the documents. When Carmen, trembling, pointed to the name Miguel Ruiz, explaining he was supposed to have been dead for 15 years, Alejandro's reaction was instantaneous. He tensed in his chair. His eyes suddenly became attentive and cautious. The name Miguel Ruiz was not unknown in the history of Vasquez Holdings. It was the name of a ghost his father had always avoided mentioning. Alejandro abruptly closed the folder, gathering the documents with quick, nervous movements. His face had become an impenetrable mask, but Carmen managed to catch something in his eyes: surprise, concern, and perhaps also fear. He said he had an urgent commitment. He left 2 €50 notes on the table and headed for the exit with a rapid step. Carmen stood there with the water jug still in her hand, watching him disappear into the Madrid night. That night she couldn't finish her shift with her usual focus. She kept thinking about Alejandro's reaction, about the way he had closed those documents, about the haste with which he had left. And above all, she kept thinking about that signature, identical to the one she remembered from her childhood. Returning home on the last metro, Carmen knew her life was about to change. She didn't yet know how, but she was certain that tonight she had opened a door to the past that someone had tried to keep closed for 15 years. Alejandro couldn't sleep that night. In his penthouse overlooking the royal palace, he paced back and forth across the living room with his father's documents spread out on the mahogany desk. The name Miguel Ruiz echoed in his mind like an echo from a past he believed buried forever. When he had inherited the company upon his father's death 8 years earlier, Alejandro had found among the personal papers a folder marked confidential. Inside were contracts, patents, highly valuable architectural projects. His father had always told him they were regular acquisitions, partnerships concluded in the 90s. But that night, looking into the green eyes of that waitress, Alejandro had seen something that shocked him, the same determination, the same intelligence that shone through the projects signed by Miguel Ruiz. The next day, Alejandro canceled all his appointments and locked himself in his office. He called Carlos Mendoza, the private detective he used for the company's most delicate matters, requesting a thorough investigation into Miguel Ruiz, an architect who had disappeared about 15 years ago. Meanwhile, Carmen had spent the day in a state of growing agitation. She hadn't been able to concentrate on her university classes. She kept thinking about that signature and Alejandro's reaction. She had tried to talk to her mother, but Isabel Ruiz had always avoided discussing the past, saying Miguel had died in an accident and it was better not to reopen old wounds. That night, Carmen arrived at the restaurant an hour early. She wanted to be sure she was there when Alejandro arrived. She had 1,000 questions to ask him, and this time she wouldn't let the social difference between them intimidate her. But Alejandro didn't show up. Table number 8 remained empty all night, and Carmen found herself serving other clients with her mind elsewhere. 3 days later, as Carmen was leaving university after an architectural design class, she found a black Mercedes with tinted windows waiting for her. The rear window rolled down, revealing Alejandro Vasquez's face. Carmen hesitated, then got into the car. The interior was luxurious, beige leather, precious wood, the scent of expensive men's fragrance. Alejandro was sitting in the opposite corner, dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. Alejandro opened a folder and extracted a series of documents, photos, newspaper articles, certificates. Carmen saw her father's face, younger than she remembered, smiling next to a man it took her a moment to recognize. It was Francisco Vasquez, Alejandro's father. In the photo, they were shaking hands in front of a construction site entrance, smiling and apparently on excellent terms. The date on the back indicated May 1994. Alejandro began to tell the story he had reconstructed. Miguel Ruiz had been a brilliant architect specializing in sustainable construction projects that were very advanced for their time. In 1994, he had established a partnership with Francisco Vasquez to develop revolutionary residential complexes. But Francisco Vasquez was a greedy and unscrupulous man. When he realized the value of Miguel's projects, he began maneuvering to exclude his partner. He falsified documents, corrupted public officials, and put Miguel in a position where it appeared he had violated building regulations. Miguel found himself involved in an investigation for building code violations and corruption. The evidence was false, but it seemed real. The judiciary opened an investigation. Newspapers began talking about a corrupt architect who had built substandard buildings. Alejandro showed Carmen the last photo. A man with gray hair, his face marked by fatigue, working on a construction site. It was clearly Miguel Ruiz, but aged and changed by suffering. He lived in Seville. He worked as a laborer for a construction company. He had changed his name, calling himself Miguel Martín. His mother had thought it better to tell her he was dead than to explain he had been forced to flee to avoid prison. Carmen burst into tears. 15 years of mourning, of growing up without a father, of believing herself an orphan, all because of the greed of a man who had wanted to appropriate her father's genius. When she asked why he was revealing all this to her, Alejandro looked at her with eyes in which Carmen saw vulnerability and humanity for the first time. When he had inherited his father's company, he had also inherited his crimes, and he understood that she had the right to know the truth. Carmen didn't return to work for 3 days. She remained locked in her room, processing the truth Alejandro had revealed to her. Her mother initially denied everything, but faced with the evidence, she confessed through tears. Miguel hadn't died. He had been forced to flee to escape the investigation orchestrated by Francisco Vasquez. She had only wanted to protect Carmen, who was too young to understand that her father had become a fugitive. Carmen was devastated. 15 years of lies, 15 years in which she could have had a father. But the anger towards her mother was nothing compared to what she felt towards the Vasquezes. On the 4th day, Alejandro showed up at her apartment in the rain, his expensive suit soaked. He wanted to make amends, to return to her father what had been stolen from him. He showed Carmen a folder with legal documents and financial calculations. He had estimated the value of the stolen projects, 50 million euros. His plan included a press conference to reveal the truth, rehabilitate Miguel, and offer him a position as creative director. When Carmen asked why he should do all this, Alejandro explained that he couldn't live knowing his wealth was built on a crime, and that since he had met her, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Carmen noticed that Alejandro was no longer the cold man from the restaurant. He was vulnerable, tormented, determined to do the right thing despite the risks. If he truly wanted to make amends, he had to take her to her father. Alejandro nodded without hesitation. The next day, boarding the private plane headed for Seville, Carmen understood that she was beginning a journey that would change everything. The Triana construction site, on the outskirts of Seville, was a dusty, noisy place where dozens of workers labored under the blazing sun. Alejandro and Carmen arrived in a taxi that contrasted with the luxury Alejandro was accustomed to, but he had insisted on not drawing attention. Carmen saw her father before he noticed her. Miguel Ruiz, now called Miguel Martín, was directing a group of workers installing a crane. At 52, he was still the tall, distinguished man Carmen remembered. But his hair had turned gray, and his face was marked with lines of fatigue. He wore work overalls stained with cement and had a yellow hard hat on his head. His hands, which Carmen remembered as always clean and precise while drawing projects, were now calloused and dirty from manual labor. When Miguel looked up and saw her, time seemed to stand still. The hard hat fell from his hands, his eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he looked like he might faint. Carmen ran towards him, and when they embraced, both burst into tears. 15 years of separation, of pain, of misunderstandings dissolved in that hug that seemed like it should never end. The workers on the site had stopped to watch this moving scene, not understanding what was happening. Alejandro remained apart, respecting the private moment between father and daughter, but at the same time feeling guilty for being the indirect cause of that separation. After the first moments of emotion, Miguel noticed Alejandro and his face became wary. When Carmen explained who he was, Miguel immediately tensed. The name Vasquez awakened in him painful memories, anger, and resentment he had tried to bury for 15 years. Alejandro approached, taking off his sunglasses and looking Miguel in the eye, explaining that he had come to ask forgiveness for what his father had done and to try to repair the damage. Miguel studied him carefully. He saw in Alejandro some traces of Francisco, but also something different, a sincerity his father had never possessed. They went to talk at a bar near the construction site. Miguel had changed into a clean shirt, but Carmen noticed how uncomfortable he felt, far from his work environment. 15 years of living in hiding had changed him, made him more cautious, less trusting. Alejandro explained his entire plan, the public rehabilitation, the financial compensation, the job offer. Miguel listened in silence, occasionally looking at Carmen as if to make sure it wasn't all a dream. When Miguel asked why he should trust him, Alejandro responded firmly that he was not his father, and that he had Carmen, who would never allow him to hurt them. Miguel looked at his daughter, seeing in her the strong, determined woman she had become despite everything. When Carmen asked him what he thought, he remained silent for long minutes, staring at his hands, ruined by manual labor. He explained that the worst part of those 15 years hadn't been the poverty or the fatigue, but knowing that somewhere his daughter was growing up without him and being unable to do anything to help her. If he accepted Alejandro's proposal, he did it not for him, but for Carmen, so that she could have the future she deserved, the one he had never been able to give her. That night, in a small hotel in Seville, Carmen and Miguel talked for hours. He told her about the years on the run, how he had had to start from zero, how much he had missed her every day. She told him about her life, her studies, the pain of growing up without a father. Alejandro left them alone, going for a walk through the streets of Seville. He had gotten what he wanted. Miguel had accepted his proposal. But he realized this was only the beginning. Publicly rehabilitating Miguel meant admitting that the Vasquez empire was built on a scam. But watching Carmen hug her father, Alejandro understood it was worth it. Not just for justice, but because he had found a reason to be a better man than his father. The press conference was organized in the conference hall of the Grand Hotel Reina Victoria in Madrid. Alejandro had invited the most important economic journalists in Spain, representatives of institutions, and all the main competitors in the construction sector. He knew that what he was about to say would cause a sensation and forever change the perception of Vasquez Holdings. Carmen was seated in the front row next to her father, who for the occasion had put on one of his old suits. After 15 years of work overalls, he felt strange in a jacket and tie. But Carmen had told him it was important for the world to see him as he had always been, a brilliant architect. Alejandro stepped up to the podium with the documents under his arm and his heart beating fast. He had prepared the speech for days, but now, looking at Miguel and Carmen, he felt he had to speak from the heart more than from the head. He began to tell the whole story, how his father Francisco Vasquez had met Miguel Ruiz, how he had stolen his projects, how he had orchestrated his ruin to appropriate his genius. He showed the original documents, the evidence of the forgeries, the testimonies of witnesses who were finally willing to speak. The room was in absolute silence. Journalists took notes frantically, cameras recorded every word. Alejandro was publicly admitting that his family's empire was built on a crime. He officially announced that Miguel Ruiz would become creative director of Vasquez Holdings with a contract guaranteeing him 5% of all future company profits. Additionally, he would receive compensation of €50 million for the damages suffered. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Alejandro announced that he had decided to transfer 40% of the company's shares to Miguel Ruiz and his daughter Carmen. A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Alejandro was giving away almost half his company to the people his father had ruined. Miguel stood up and approached the microphone. For the first time in 15 years, he could speak publicly with his real name. He explained that Francisco Vasquez had not only stolen his projects, but also his family, his dignity, his life. Today, Alejandro had had the courage to admit the truth and to repair the damage. But the most important thing he had recovered wasn't the money or the job, it was his daughter, and for that he would always be grateful to Alejandro Vasquez. The press conference made all the news broadcasts. Newspaper headlines spoke of the CEO who renounces his fortune for justice and the largest reparation in Spanish history. That night, Alejandro, Carmen, and Miguel dined together at El Prado, the same restaurant where it had all begun. Carmen no longer wore the waitress uniform, but an elegant blue dress Alejandro had given her. Miguel, after 15 years, could finally afford to eat at one of the most expensive restaurants in Madrid. Miguel raised his glass of wine for a toast to justice, which always arrives, even if sometimes it takes 15 years. As they toasted, Alejandro looked at Carmen and saw something in her eyes that went beyond gratitude. There was affection, admiration, and perhaps something deeper. When Alejandro said he had to go to Paris for an important contract and asked Carmen to accompany him, not as an employee, but as a partner and perhaps something more, Carmen blushed. In a few days, this man had completely changed her life. Miguel looked at his daughter and Alejandro and smiled. 15 years of suffering seemed finally to have made sense. From evil, something beautiful had been born, not only justice, but also love. 6 months after the press conference that had shaken the Spanish business world, Vasquez Holdings had become a completely different company. Miguel Ruiz had revolutionized the design approach, introducing sustainable technologies and innovative designs that had already become a model for the entire sector. Carmen had left university to devote herself fully to the family business, demonstrating that she had inherited not only her father's intelligence, but also a natural talent for business. Her first proposal, to transform old industrial buildings into sustainable residential complexes, had secured contracts worth over 100 million euros. Alejandro had maintained his position as CEO, but now he shared every important decision with Miguel and Carmen. Their collaboration had become perfect. Miguel contributed creativity and technical innovation, Carmen brought energy and fresh ideas, and Alejandro provided management experience and international contacts. But the most important transformation was personal. Alejandro and Carmen had become inseparable, and their professional relationship had evolved into something much deeper. They worked together during the day and spent their evenings planning future projects, visiting construction sites, dreaming of more beautiful and sustainable cities. One spring night, Alejandro took Carmen to the terrace of his penthouse. Madrid stretched out at their feet, lit by the night lights, with the royal palace shining like a jewel in the city center. Alejandro pointed to an area of the city, explaining it was their next project. 500 sustainable apartments with vertical gardens and solar panels. Miguel had already made the first sketches. But what he wanted to tell her was something else. She had become the most important thing in his life, more important than the company, more important than the money, more important than everything. He took out a small blue velvet box. Inside was an engagement ring with a diamond that reflected the city lights. Carmen looked at him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. She thought of the extraordinary journey that had brought them there, from waitress and customer in a luxury restaurant to fiancés about to become husband and wife. She agreed to marry the man who had had the courage to acknowledge his father's mistakes and repair the damage, the man who had given her back her family. The wedding was celebrated 3 months later in the garden of the new villa they had bought together in the hills of the Sierra de Guadarrama. Miguel walked Carmen down the aisle, proud to finally be present at the most important moment in his daughter's life. Isabel, Carmen's mother, cried with joy seeing her family finally reunited and happy. She had forgiven Alejandro for his father's sins, seeing the sincere love he felt for Carmen and the respect he showed towards Miguel. During the ceremony, Alejandro and Carmen exchanged rings and promises of love, but above all they exchanged the promise to continue together the work of reconstruction they had begun, not only of the company, but of a new way of doing business based on honesty, innovation, and social responsibility. The first project they signed as husband and wife was the construction of a training center for young architects and engineers. The building would be dedicated to Francisco Vasquez, not to honor his crimes, but to remind that even from the mistakes of the past, one can learn and build a better future. Miguel became the director of the center. His first lesson was dedicated to the importance of professional ethics and the value of always making the right choice, even when it's difficult. A year after the wedding, Carmen gave birth to a daughter they named Sofia. When Miguel held his granddaughter in his arms for the first time, Carmen saw in his eyes the same tenderness she remembered from her childhood. Alejandro had become not only a loving husband, but also an adoptive son to Miguel. That night in their new home, while Sofia slept in her crib and Miguel browsed through a photo album recovering all the lost memories, Alejandro and Carmen sat on the terrace looking at the stars. Carmen thought that sometimes fate has strange ways of fixing things. Who would have said that a signature on a contract in a restaurant would have changed all their lives? Alejandro kissed her gently. Fate had made them meet, but they had been the ones who chose to do the right thing, and they would continue to choose good every day for the rest of their lives. Looking at Madrid, shining in the night with the projects of their company building a better future, they knew they had found much more than they had ever dreamed. They had found love, family, and the certainty that even from the greatest pains, something beautiful can be made. Because sometimes all it takes is the courage of a waitress who recognizes her father's signature and the honesty of a CEO who decides to repair the sins of the past to change the destiny of many lives and prove that justice, even if it arrives late, always arrives. Hit like if you believe it's never too late to repair the mistakes of the past. Comment which moment of the story impacted you the most. Share to inspire those who believe that truth always triumphs over lies. Subscribe for more stories of justice, love, and second chances. Sometimes just recognizing a signature is enough to change a family's destiny. Sometimes it takes courage to admit mistakes and become the right man. And sometimes love is born just when you least expect it, in the most difficult moment, because true wealth is not what you inherit, but what you build with honesty and love.